Natasha Sahai, the managing editor of War on the Rocks. You're listening to Horns of a Dilemma. This episode is part of a series of special live Horns episodes bringing you into the room at the 5th Annual Texas National Security Forum, hosted by our partners at the Clemens Center, the Strauss Center, and the Clemens Strauss Intelligence Studies Project. The forum was held in late November at the University of Texas at Austin. In this first installment, World Order, Lawrence Freday of the LBJ School of Public Affairs moderated a discussion with Tony Blinken, former Deputy Secretary of State, Eric Edelman, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and Kristen Silverberg, former ambassador to the EU. We hope you enjoyed the discussion.
All right, so good morning, everybody. Thank you to Will and to Bobby for putting this wonderful forum together. I have the honor to moderate this first panel today. And we've been given the very narrow and niche topic, thank you, Will, of world order. So my hunch is we'll need about half an hour, 35 minutes, then we'll be done. You'll have extra time for breakfast. But seriously, we have a distinguished panel of experts here to enlighten you on this crucial geopolitical topic. And I want to give our panelists as much time as possible to share their insights with you. And I also assume that all of the audience knows how to use Google. So I'm not going to give very long introductions. But in a nutshell, we have with us Tony Blinken, former Deputy Secretary of State and former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Barack Obama. We have Eric Edelman, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey under President George W. Bush. And Kristen Silverberg, former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and former Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs under President George W. Bush. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes to offer some short introductory remarks. Please keep to your time limit so that we can have as much interaction among the panelists afterwards as we can. Then I'll ask a few questions to get a conversation going, and then I want to use at least half of that Q&A time to take questions from the audience. So let's begin in the order that the panelists appear on the program. So I'm going to start with Tony.
Great. Lawrence, thank you very much, and good morning. I can't believe this turnout. I think most of you folks think this is actually the Longhorn send-off, but it's not, but we'll do our best to keep the excitement level. Will, Bobby, great to be with you. Wonderful to be here with my friends and colleagues as well. As we're contemplating the question of world order, or maybe world disorder, I often get asked, how I feel about the state of things. And I really like to quote the late Senator John McCain, who said memorably that it is always darkest before it goes completely black. And with that as a lead-in, what I want to talk about briefly is, before we get to a conversation, is this. I do think we're at a profound inflection point. And that inflection point is even broader than great power competition that we're talking about today, but great power competition really feeds into it and also accelerates it. And the inflection point is this, at least as I see it. If you look at the profound divisions that we're seeing around the world today, including in our own country, increasingly what we're seeing is not a division between left and right, Republican and Democrat, liberal and conservative. It really is a division between those of us who believe that confronted with incredibly complex change, the best answer is to kind of hunker down and play defense, versus those of us who believe that we somehow need to stay open and connected and do what we can to shape these forces of change to our advantage, or at least mitigate their downsides. In other words, to put it colloquially, it really is the difference between those of us who believe the answer to our interests in the future is to build a wall of some kind, versus those who believe we need to keep building bridges. And I was in government for almost 25 years. And as I've spent the last couple of years trying to reflect, I've been asking myself how we got to this particular moment. And I think what I've come up with is not particularly novel, but it does reflect at least the ability to have had a little bit of time to look at things from a distance, not the day in, day out grind of government. So it seems to me that there have been 3 broad trends that have brought us to this moment. And they're no less important for being obvious. 1, the extraordinary rapidity and depth of technological change, combined with this overabundance of information that we're all dealing with every day, and the sense that borders have eroded around the world. That's created a sense of chaos, of confusion, of vulnerability among so many of our fellow citizens, a sense that the world really is in disorder and they can't explain or understand how it works. And that's having a profound effect, again, on making people just feel out of sorts. Second, a paradox. Many of you have read people like Steven Pinker. They'll tell you that by virtually every metric, our country and indeed the world has never been better off than it is today. It's healthier, it's wealthier, it's wiser, it's more secure, it's even more tolerant. And yet, as we know, so many people have been left out or left behind from that progress. And maybe the best way to illustrate it is to say that over the last 25 or 30 years, if you look at it, there's been an extraordinary amount of progress in dealing with poverty around the world. The numbers are staggering in terms of improvement. But at the same time, we know inequality is actually rising. And the amount of money that a smaller and smaller group of people control has gotten bigger and bigger. And that feeds, coupled with the financial crisis in 2008, a growing sense of anger, resentment. And you combine that with this sense of chaos and confusion and vulnerability, and you start to get what is amounting to a perfect storm. And then one final trend, and that really does go to the heart of what we're talking about today. And that is just a profound shift in power relationships, not just among nations, but indeed beyond them, below them, on their side. So we've got the emergence of powers that Lawrence talked about, but we also have a whole host of new actors. It may be the mayor of a megacity, it may be a corporate chieftain, it may be a super empowered group or individual. And each has a much greater ability than ever before to kind of veto the decisions that traditional sources of authority, like a national government, would make. And you add to that, in so many, unfortunately, of our democracies, governments afflicted with political paralysis, with extreme partisanship, increasingly in different ways with corruption, and you wind up with a crisis of legitimacy in our institutions. So you put all of that together, and it creates an almost perfect environment where people are looking for those who project themselves as strong leaders with very simple answers to what are, at least in my judgment, pretty complex problems. And then you get a resurgence of nationalism, of populism, of xenophobia, unilateralism, isolationism of one kind or another. This is not a new story. We've been there before. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes and then turn it over to my colleagues, recalling some of the lessons of history, because I think they're instructive for today. And after all, as we know, those who forget history are condemned to retweet it. So if you think about it, we've faced this choice before. After World War I, as many of the students here know very well from studying it, for understandable reasons, in a sense, we retreated. We decided to reject participation in the League of Nations. As economic troubles started to rear their head, we became protectionist. As dictators began to emerge, we became isolationist. And one result of this retreat was a global conflagration that made the first war to end all wars just a prelude to something even worse. And then after World War II, we got something that you rarely get, a second chance, a do-over. And we could have chosen to do the same thing. We could have chosen to pull back, given all that we'd put into that effort. We could have chosen to lord our power over everyone else, because at that point in history, we really were the last power left standing. Everyone else was afflicted with terrible challenges, but we didn't do that. Instead, we do what's been talked about a lot over the last couple of years. We took the lead, not in a neat linear way, but ultimately, if you look at the sweep of history, we took the lead in building a new order with institutions, with rules and norms that we took the lead in shaping and also defending. And in some sense, it was counterintuitive, because we checked our own power. We constrained ourselves. We bound ourselves to these same rules and norms and institutions as everyone else. But it had powerfully positive effects. It meant that as a result of giving others a voice and a vote in the system, we prevented what usually happens in history when one power rises above others, and that's the others all get together to try and check its power. That didn't really happen. And second, by making very significant investments in the security and prosperity of other countries, we got that investment back 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. New markets for our products, new partners to deal with global challenges, new allies to deter aggression. And we all know this system was far from perfect. The ideals and the reality never perfectly matched. Colonialism, apartheid lasted for decades. We've had proxy wars and civil wars of one kind or another. And of course, all sorts of socioeconomic dislocations. But the big picture, preventing another conflagration among the great powers, and then lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, many into a global middle class, that's a pretty good success story. So the question for those of us who believe in the fundamentals of that system, even as we acknowledge it needs to be profoundly amended to account for those who are left out and left behind and don't feel that they're part of the system or progress, the challenge for those of us is to figure out right now how to amend it and how to really make clear that the alternatives are a lot worse. And that's what I want to leave you with. It seems to me that as we think about world order, we really face this choice. Either the United States continues to play the role that it's played for 70 plus years in helping to lead and shape that order, or one of two things. Either someone else or someone else will do it, but probably not to our interests and values, or maybe even worse, no one does it. And then we fall back into anarchy, what my friend Bob Kagan calls the jungle. That's the choice before us. That, I think, is the landscape as we're thinking about world order that we have to contend with.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Eric?
Thank you, Lawrence. It's great to be here. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Bobby, for inviting me and particularly for putting me on a panel with two terrific former colleagues. I had the privilege of working with Tony in the Clinton administration, and then when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and I was in the Bush administration. I do find it a little disconcerting that I'm situated here on his left. That seems wrong somehow, but it's great to be reunited with Kristen, with whom I worked in the Bush administration, and then on a series of projects, including the Romney campaign, where we tried very hard to put Tony on the unemployment line, and
That's looking pretty good now.
yeah, right. Yeah,
That's perfect.
you'd like to have us back now, wouldn't you? What's President Bush's approval rating at? We worked together as well on a project to preserve conservative internationalism in the Republican Party after 2012, and you can see how well that's worked out. So it's really great to be here. I agree largely with what Tony said, but let me try and fill in some of the gaps that might be usefully addressed. So Lawrence and I were talking before the panel began about what the nature is of the period we have entered, and we don't really have a good taxonomy for it. The post-Cold War, the period that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992 and came to an end, I think, roughly around 2007, 2008, with the Great Recession, 25-year period, was marked by a couple of things. First, the United States was the unipolar moment. It was the sole remaining superpower. We had a vast preponderance of power, as Dean Acheson might have said, with regard to anybody else on the planet militarily. Essentially, our power was uncontested. It came on the back of the so-called third wave of democratization that Samuel Huntington identified in the 1980s, but which continued to roll through the 1990s and up to the early 2000s. It was a period of great power comedy. That is to say, the United States and China and Russia in the 1990s were trying to work together constructively to solve a bunch of global order problems that seemed pretty trivial compared to the big problems that had beset us during the Cold War. And we didn't always work very smoothly with either Russia or China, but still the general trend was to work together cooperatively, and certainly the cooperative part outstripped the competitive part. It was the end of history, as my Cornell classmate Frank Fukuyama described it, which is to say ideological competition seemed at a minimum. And in fact, everybody was agreed that the Washington Consensus, that free markets, open societies, freedom of capital movement were important parts of the global order. If you think about those elements today, almost every one of them has essentially reversed. If you think of those as pluses, you'd have to put a minus in front of every one of those. So the United States margin of military superiority has been shrinking since for the last decade anyway. Secretary Hagel in 2013 talked about the declining margin of superiority that the United States had vis-a-vis other great powers in the world, Russia, China. I've just chaired the National Defense Strategy Commission, independent commission chartered by Congress to review the Department of Defense's national defense strategy, and we have found, and it's a bipartisan panel, and we found unanimously that, if anything, Secretary Hagel was understating the issue. Our margin is much reduced. The wave of democratization has clearly gone into reverse. If you look at Freedom House's assessments of global freedom, the number of free countries has declined. And we see the rise of authoritarianism around the world, populist authoritarianism. You see it in Europe, but you see it in Asia as well, in the Philippines and other parts of the world. Ideological competition is back. It's not back in the form of capitalism versus communism, but there clearly is a ideological component, as my occasional co-author Hal Brands has argued, in the great power competition we see today between authoritarianism and continued belief in democracy and lowercase l liberal values. And on top of that, instead of great power comedy, we now see a return of great power competition. And that's something that was identified in the previous administration by Secretary of Defense Carter and has now become the organizing principle of the Trump administration's national security strategy released last December and the national defense strategy that was released in January of this year. There is some debate about whether there is such a thing as the normative, rules-based liberal international order. And I think it's a little bit, in my mind, like Justice Stewart's definition of pornography, which is I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it. I think that, if anyone looks reasonably at the history of the international order since 1945, it is clear that the United States went about establishing a set of institutions and practices that were meant to reduce the chances of the kind of great power clashes that Tony was talking about that marked the 20th century in not a positive way, by having a more open trading system, and by the United States, for the first time really in its history, taking on political responsibility for guaranteeing the security of others through its multilateral treaties with European powers and NATO, and the bilateral treaties that it signed with East Asian powers in the course of the early 1950s. And then the special relationships that it developed with a number of Middle Eastern countries as British power retrograded from the region and left the United States responsible for the balance of power in the Middle East as well after 1966. The question we face today, as Tony says, is whether we are going to continue to support that system. And I agree with Tony that the alternative to it is it's not self-sustaining. The international order will not just keep on ticking over. It requires some power to manage it, and that's been true in the past. It was true when the British were managing the international system essentially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it now, unfortunately relies on us. I don't really see any other country that is either willing or capable of doing it for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. So I think the alternative is not that some other nation is likely to run the order, although China might step up 25 years from now and try and play that role. I'm not sure people will really like that. If you want to get a taste of what that might be like, I recommend you read Martin Jack's book, When China Rules the World. It's going to not be a world that people are going to find as congenial as the one that the United States has managed since 1945. The issue, I think, is whether we're willing to pay for this, because it will cost us money. It will require sacrifice by Americans to do this. And the danger I think we face right now is pretending that we are still willing and capable of doing this while not adequately funding what is required, and I don't just mean the military, I mean the international means that we have in our government, the State Department, the intelligence agencies, the Treasury, the other instruments of national power, in order to do it. I can think of no more dangerous place for the nation to be than to pretend that we are going to uphold this order and not have the means to do it.
Thank you.
Great. Well, first, I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm an Austin native and a UT Law grad, and have just been wowed. Thank you, Bobby, by what Will and Bobby have built here. It's just a incredible, impressive accomplishment. So thank you all for being here this morning. So as Eric was saying, I think there's we could spend all morning on the definitional question about what do we mean by world order. I mean something like the current alliance systems in Europe and Asia, the set of international institutions, and in some cases global treaties, the open trading system, and it's basically the web of relations and institutions that have helped to gradually build US influence in the post-war period, and also to, I think, gradually spread kind of democratic values throughout the world. There are lots and lots of reasons why the current system is strained. Some of them are the great power issues that Eric just referenced. We have a more assertive Russia under Putin that I think would like to do away with a global order altogether and return to more of a spheres of influence system. We have a more assertive China under Xi, who I think likes the idea of a global order, but wants to remake it in a way that serves China's interest. But to go back to some of Tony's comments, some of the biggest threats to the current order are self-inflicted on our part. And I'll just mention a couple of them. One is that the current system, the post-war system, was built in part around the gravitational pull of the US economy. So through most of the Cold War, the Soviet economy was about half the size of the US economy, and the Soviet bloc's major trading partners were countries like Cuba and North Korea. And so the Soviets could compete with us militarily. In some parts of the world, they could compete with us on values. They could meddle in our democracy by stoking dissent and racial tension. But there really wasn't an economic competition in any sense. And it was inevitable in that, with that kind of an imbalance, that we were going to win converts to our side. So when you look at from 1947, when the original GATT agreement was signed, the kind of early stage trade agreement, to 1986, the last round of the GATT, you had 23 signatories at the beginning and 123 signatories at the end. We just had a very compelling talking point that our system was going to help, make countries more prosperous. And I say this because every day that we don't tackle our long-term economic health, so every day that we don't deal with our fiscal situation, that we don't think about how we're going to educate poor kids, that we don't tackle some of the inequality issues and the lack of social mobility that Tony mentioned, is a day when we're giving the Chinese an extra talking point. We're not going to win this next round by default. The Chinese will be real competitors, and so one of the things we have to think about is that. The second big self-inflicted wound, I think, is our failure to think about this next stage in the global order in terms of a win-win. So I think, as Eric was saying, or Tony, we came out of the post-war period militarily, economically dominant, and we intentionally set up a system that would grow economies overseas. So we said we would rather live in a world where we had a little more economic competition, but in exchange for that got more stability, where we had more sort of countries bought into the system. And so the fact that we have more competition from emerging markets is a feature, not a bug, of the current system. It's actually one of its great successes. And sometimes in the debate in Washington here now, you think about, there's a sort of, we lost that win-win mentality, and whatever comes next in the sort of evolution of the world order, it's going to have to be one where there's an argument to other countries that they need to participate in our version of the system. So I really liked Eric and Tony's comments, in part because they avoided the problem you get at a lot of discussions in Washington about the kind of world order, which tend to fall into two extremes. They're sort of the anti-globalist crowd, that says, why do we need a world order? We particularly don't need a liberal world order. We're just kind of happy with, let's make America great, and we're just going to keep to our own business. And then on the other side, there's a think tank crowd that seems to kind of lapse into hysteria. So the world's on fire, and I don't mean to pick on the Aspen Strategy Group because I think Tony's a member, but they put out a yes, exactly. They put out a report this year called "The World Turned Upside Down" or something. I mean, it's just it's a little topsy-turvy. It's not totally upside down yet. And so, one of the kind of orientations we need to take on this is to avoid, steer between these two shoals. So I think we need to adopt a kind of foundational framers mindset. So it can't be that we're just nostalgic for the old order. The fact that it served us so well over the last 75 years doesn't mean it's perfectly designed to serve us for the next 75. So we don't need hysteria, but we also have to think about a world order. The U.S. won't do well in the spheres of influence system that Putin has in mind, or in a kind of highly disorderly system. And so we ought to think about kind of what comes next. And I don't think the Trump administration is anywhere near sort of an actual strategy on this. But I think they're making some decisions that are going to have a key impact on kind of the long-term evolution of it. And there are some things they're doing I like, and some things I don't like. And I'll sort of talk about a couple of those. So on the kinds of things I disapprove of, they seem to be undermining the idea of a rules-based system. So on the one hand, you see some Trump administration trade actions that are meant to tell other countries that they need to abide by the rules that we negotiated. So for example, they've been criticizing the Chinese government for intellectual property and trade practices that are violation of global agreements, and that's totally appropriate and overdue, in fact. On the other hand, they seem to be making up some new rules as they go along. So they've used Section 232, which is this longstanding trade rule, to create some protectionist measures around steel and aluminum. They've threatened to use it around auto tariffs, and it's a kind of distortion of what that particular provision was meant to do. In my mind, the only system that's going to work for the U.S. going forward is going to be rules-based, meaning that we get other countries to abide by the rules, and we agree to abide by them too. And that's largely because we're a private sector run economy. If you're an, if you're a government, authoritarian government like China, you can live with ambiguity in rules. If you're a private sector player, you have to have certainty, rule of law, and other things. So in my mind, one thing the Trump administration needs to get back to is the idea that we're going to have global rules, and we in the United States are going to abide by them. The second big mistake I think they're making is taking values off the table. So as I said, in the old, the current world order was built in part on sort of the strength of our economic case. So our predecessors certainly made the values argument, but even if they hadn't, we had such a strong and compelling economic case that countries probably would have been on our side anyway. In the next round, we're going to have real economic competition, and one of the things the U.S. is going to be able to bring to the table is that our system is better, it's more moral, it's more just. And so I think we're going to have to put the kind of question of U.S. values and the benefits of democratic and accountable systems back on the table. On the plus side, I think the Trump administration has done a really useful thing in revisiting our China strategy. So for the last kind of 20 years, we've had a pretty stable approach to China that's kind of focused on helping to get the Chinese engaged in the current system, what we called the kind of responsible stakeholder strategy. We promoted economic liberalization in China, and depending on who you talk to, you might have heard in the last couple decades this hope that China would liberalize politically. And I think a lot of things have changed the debate in Washington, made people less hopeful about all those things. Some of it is that changes in China and Xi. Some of it is that we see just a more confident China, more confident that it can manage its rise without liberalizing politically. And so I think the Trump administration has very usefully put on the table a kind of the list of U.S. grievances, everything from the trade and IP practices to assertiveness against neighbors to human rights, religious freedom, and so on. However, I think we're still in what I think of as sort of a pre-strategy phase. So right now we have the kind of list of grievances, but we don't have an actual strategy about how we're going to prioritize those or move forward. I've compared this to something like 1946, where there was sort of a growing appreciation in Washington about the Soviet threat, but there wasn't really a sense of how we were going to attack that. And it took this famous diplomat, George Kennan, to write something called the Long Telegram, which eventually became an article and eventually kind of found its way into a national security directive to focus the US on what our priority was, which was basically to confront the Soviet expansion overseas. And that strategy sort of gave rise to basically guided US policy till 1989. So I think the period we're in right now and the sort of the mandate, the call to our generation of foreign policy experts is to start defining that problem, to take our kind of list of grievances and turn it into an actual set of priorities and strategy. And I will stop there.
All right, thank you. So several of you mentioned the liberal world order as sort of the starting point of what happened to it or what is happening to it. And it seems to me that many of you argued that it's this idea that we had right after the Cold War ended, that this liberal world order is going to be universally accepted, everybody's going to join it, support it, that seems to have evaporated. But my question is, do you see anything else in terms of this moral underpinning or ideological underpinning of the liberal order that we used to have? Can anything else replace it? I mean, you were talking about how all these different countries are becoming potentially more closed off. What could replace the small L liberal descriptor of the world order? And if there isn't such a thing, can we have a world order that doesn't have that kind of ideological underpinning? And if so, what would that world order look like? So maybe I'll start with Tony.
I'll just say very quickly, I think that, yes, really the choice is between some order and disorder, but within the order world, what's the nature of that order? And I think we've touched on that to some extent. I think the challenge we face is that if we are going through abdication to give up on reconstituting and amending the liberal world order, as my colleagues have said, then I think maybe sooner than Eric thinks, others will step up and there'll be an order, but instead of being liberal in its aspirations, it will be illiberal. And that's not something that I think would be good for us. And then, of course, the alternative really is not necessarily global anarchy, but at least anarchy in chunks of the world and this jungle that Kagan and others talk about. So I think that really is the choice.
I think it's dangerous for us to sit up here and talk about this as if it's some kind of abstraction. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think we've lost over the last 25 years of the post-Cold War is a sense of how bad things can really get in the international order and how violent they can be. Now, it's not like there's any shortage of violence in the world, with all due respect to Professor Pinker. I mean, I take his point that it's a secular trend downward, but if you're in Syria right now, you probably don't really take much solace in that, or in Yemen. But those are in sort of fairly, from our point of view, remote parts of the world. I mean, the prospect that we could have conflicts of the size and scale that we had in the Second World War is something that I think just absolutely eludes us. We just don't think about it. Partially we don't think about it because of the presence of nuclear weapons and the assumption that things would go nuclear very quickly if you got into a great power war with either Russia or China. That might be true, but it also might not be true. And so there's a potential for very long, very painful, and very violent conflicts. I mean, both sides had chemical weapons during World War II. Nobody used them. It didn't stop World War II from being an incredibly violent, destructive war, the most destructive war in the history of the world. And I mean, I've just been reading an astonishing book by Adam Towse called The Deluge, about the last 2 years of World War II and the early efforts of the United States and the European powers put the world back together, and it's just a description of the violence going on in Europe at that time as a result of the Russian Revolution, the German offensives on the Western Front. I mean, it can get really bad. And so, you know, it's fine to sit here and talk about it, you know, liberal world order or more disorder. More disorder could be, you know, astonishingly bad. And when you say, what's the alternative to the liberal order? Well, the alternative in the years between the wars was countries becoming, attempting to become more autarkic, more autonomous, not abiding by any kind of rules in the system. And we know how it ended up. You know, you don't get to run experiments very often in international affairs, but we know how that one ended. And I don't think it's a place any of us want to go again.
I think there are a few different alternatives if we sort of abandon the effort to sustain the order. One is the return to the kind of, you know, a spheres of influence system. And I think that would be very bad for us. Those spheres of influence are inherently unstable because the lines of demarcation are contested. They're very bad for the countries who live under them. So they sort of undermine this concept of sovereignty. And three is that that doesn't parcel out the world in a way that actually works for our interests. So it basically gives, you know, China, you know, as the predominant power in the part of the world that's growing the fastest, Russia a lot of influence over some energy producing parts of the world. And so anyway, I don't think we'd be very unhappy under that system. Another alternative is that we, as Tony and Eric were saying, is that we have a global order, but it's one that's sort of reoriented to China's interests. And I'll say that we can see signs of China making moves in that direction. At the moment, you know, they are purporting to offer something that's basically a kind of, you know, what's purporting to be a win-win solution by offering these massive infrastructure investments in their neighbors. And there are huge downsides to those deals for some of the countries. They can create some unsustainable debt burdens. They can lose some of their governance, you know, over key kind of national assets. But if we don't have anything to offer in its place, my guess is that countries are going to feel like that's their only alternative. So, yeah, so I do think there are alternatives to a U.S.-led global order, but they don't work out very well for us.
Mm-hmm. So, to piggyback on that, if we're thinking about world order as mostly the structures that shape the relationships between the great powers, I think, you know, these do seem to be the alternatives. But what I wanted to ask you about is, you know, the G20 is going on this weekend in Buenos Aires, and, you know, one fourth of those countries that are being represented there actually have a smaller GDP than what Amazon is worth. So one thing that I think is different from our current attempts at world order is that there are other actors, especially in the economic sphere, who are way more powerful than the actors were in 1948. And so how do you see that playing out in terms of how the global world order is going to accommodate or be shaped by these economic forces that are not great powers, or at least not great state powers as we think of them? Maybe start with Kristen this time.
Sure. Well, I think, you know, the system that, you know, the great powers play a key role in kind of shaping the environment that gives rise to some of these important players. So the fact that we had a free market economy, that we have a system that promotes innovation and technology is part of why we have these massive companies. And one of the interesting dynamics I think that's going to play out over the next decade is the role of the big Chinese big techs, which are becoming enormous. You know, if you look at a company like Alibaba or Tencent, they basically are Netflix, Uber, Amazon, Facebook, all kind of wrapped up into one company. But what's particularly interesting is they're all those things, but with close ties to the Chinese state. So they help to pursue, you know, they're right now helping with the urbanization challenges and creating these smart cities. They're providing transportation systems, self-driving cars, but they're also playing a role in facial identification. So, you know, things that will improve the ability of the Chinese government to monitor citizens. Some of the big, you know, the fastest growing technology companies are partly owned by the PLA, by the, you know, Chinese military. So anyway, so I think one thing we're going to see playing out in this year is competition between our kind of private sector firms, which are incredibly impressive and technologically driven, and their firms, which have this symbiotic relationship with the state and have control of massive amounts of data. And so we're going to have to think basically of a way of how are we going to compete economically when companies like that are competing not only in China, but also in other parts of the world.
And this really risks, I think Kristen makes a really important point, because what we're at risk of seeing are the emergence of technological spheres of influence, where Chinese technology and the norms that it applies to that technology dominate in one part of the world. Ours may predominate in another. Some other country may emerge technologically and do the same. And that's why we have a profound stake in actually not only thinking about, but acting on and shaping these rules. If we don't, I think that technological sphere of influence is going to emerge much more quickly than we think. And it's also why companies and government have a really powerful incentive to figure out ways to work together in ways that they haven't in the past. And instead of seeing that, we're seeing, especially over the last 5 or so years, many of our major tech companies and government on a collision course, which worries me profoundly, because at the end of the day, if companies won't take responsibility for some of the excesses of creative disruption, if they won't do it, then government will. And then usually government comes in and overregulates, which doesn't really serve anyone's interest. But that's the trajectory we're on if folks don't stand up and take a little bit more proactive responsibility. And there's a real, I think, mutual interest in working together precisely to avoid the world cleaving off into different technological spheres.
Well, I largely agree with what both Kristen and Tony have said. I mean, in the National Defense Strategy Commission report, one of the issues we address, which at first blush you might think, why are they talking about this, is the issue of whether or not China ends up being the standard setter for 5G. And, that's actually, we believe in the commission, a bipartisan basis again, a fundamental national security issue for us. Because if China sets the standard for 5G, our military is so reliant on some of those systems that it would be very, very bad for us. So I think that's extremely important. I'd also like to pick up on Tony's point about the unwillingness of some elements of the private sector to see themselves as American companies and therefore, as opposed to global companies, and therefore unwilling to work with particularly the Department of Defense. And we've seen some instances of that recently with Maven and the statements by Google employees, et cetera. This led General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Halifax Forum recently, to point out that, hey, we are the good guys. I think it's actually imperative for companies like Google and Facebook to understand that as much as they are global companies, they also are providing a platform for the waging of essentially political warfare against the United States every day. One of the findings of our commission was that not only are we in competition, a strategic competition in the long term with Russia and China, but in the so-called gray zone, which exists both in a geographic and in a functional way, we're actually in conflict with Russia and China every day in cyber, in information operations. This is ongoing. I mean, we tend to focus a lot in the United States right now on the Russia piece of this because of the interference in the election in 2016 and ongoing efforts by Russia to do that. But if we were having this conversation in Australia or New Zealand, the focus would be very much on China and China's effort to exert influence through non-traditional means, including electronic media and social media, et cetera. For anybody who hasn't seen it, I commend to you the Australian series Secret City, which you can see on Netflix, which kind of goes into this in some detail. You're beginning to see that discussion now in the United States about Huawei and ZTE and their role in the economy, but also the Confucius Institutes, et cetera. So this is something that is with us every day, and I think it is incumbent on companies whose platforms are being weaponized against the United States, to both take that into account and to, as General Dunford said, understand who the good guys and the bad guys are here. One final comment on this. There's been a long literature going back to the 90s about the retreat of the state and the decline of the state as a unit of account in the international system and the rise of non-state actors, particularly on the economic side. When I was ambassador to Finland, Nokia had a market cap that was bigger than the GDP of the entire country. Of course, that's not the case now, but they made a couple of bad decisions that left them in the dust. But these are important factors to bear in mind. However, the state still matters, and it's still the fundamental unit of account in international affairs. And particularly in an era of great power competition, it's great to say that you're a multinational company and you're not beholden to the United States government, and you can have that view, but when the shooting starts, you're probably going to have a different view.
So one of the questions that I just want to pick up on, you mentioned that China and Russia have these plans, right, to at least undermine this liberal order or have a different vision of world order. But it seems to me that at least relatively deeply thinking Russian, Chinese strategists also don't want a complete world disorder. That doesn't really serve anybody's interest, especially if you're a great power. You're a great power because this was the world order that was created. But my question is, do you see any common threads in these, especially these illiberal regimes, of what kind of world order they would like to see instead of the one that we have now? Because it seems to me that, as I used to say, sort of in the European context, that the rallying cry of xenophobes of the world unite doesn't really work, right? So what's that? Is the alternative simply alternative spheres of influence where everybody has their own little backyard and there is no real global world order? You just have small regional orders, or how do you sort of see their view? If we had some Chinese and Russian national security experts on this panel, how would they sort of see the ideal outcome?
Well, it's just starting here, and I think starting with China, I think you would start with in effect a regional order based on their norms and interests that they would hope eventually expand outward. And look, the challenge that we have is that there really is the emergence of an alternative model to liberal democracy, or a reemergence in terms of sort of techno-autocratic states that, at least on the surface, are doing a pretty good job in delivering for their people at a time when we're having, as Kristen said so eloquently, we're having trouble doing that. And another thing I think that Kristen pointed to earlier, which is really important, is the economic domination that we enjoyed has dissipated. And there are both good reasons for that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there was a great scholar of democracy that some of you will remember because I think he hailed from around here. His name was J.R. Ewing. And back in the 1980s, there was something called the Dallas effect, which is to say people around the world watched Dallas and programs like it. They saw this tremendous success and wealth. They wanted the same thing, and they thought that our political system had to come along with that if they were going to achieve and aspire to what they were seeing. That's no longer the case. We're getting to a point where about 50% of the world's wealth will be generated by non-free countries. And if they're delivering, that becomes a pretty powerful model and magnet. So I think you're going to see, Russia's a different story. I mean, I see Russia as essentially a declining power, but one that's doing a tremendous amount of damage on the way down. China, on the other hand, has very different aspirations. But here's the challenge, too, for us. Even as we are rightly focusing on this new challenge, we can't have the pendulum swing, at least in my judgment, too far in the other direction. So, for example, with China, we somehow have to figure out a way to maintain a system that is open and collaborative out of our own self-interest. The innovations that we're seeing at great universities like this one in Silicon Valley, they depend to a large extent on that openness and collaboration. So if we drown the baby with the bathwater, we're going to have another problem that's going to be very hard to undo.
Well, I largely agree with what's been said. I do think the Russians and Chinese, as Tony said, both have essentially for the moment regional ambitions. China's a little more ambiguous because they have regional ambitions that could, because of their growth very rapidly, morph into more global ambitions, although we should not underestimate the scale of the problems that China faces. I mean, we tend to focus a lot on the dangers of a growing, rising China, and that's appropriate. We should. But we also should remember that China has got enormous problems. They've got enormous public debt that has funded a lot of their rise that may not be sustainable. They have a gigantic demographic challenge that has been created by the one-child policy, and you can already see its effects in China, which is the labor force is already beginning to decline. And you've seen work stoppages and pressures that have begun to push wages up in China, which have led in some cases to some U.S. enterprises returning manufacturing to the United States. You've got the so-called bare branches phenomenon, which is because of sex-selective abortion and infanticide in China. You've got, depending on which demographer you believe, somewhere between 25 million and 40 million unattached young men with no prospects for marriage, which means the country faces what my wife calls the national level problem of testosterone poisoning. And they've got enormous environmental problems that have to be remediated, the cost of which is sort of staggering. We tend to be very cognizant of the strengths that China has, and the Chinese government tends to be very wary of their weaknesses, which is why they are so, bound and determined to monitor their entire society, the social credit system, all the things that Kristen was talking about as well. So China, when you describe the problems we face in managing world order, they're enormous. And they're probably the biggest challenges this nation has ever faced because they're the most complex that we've ever had to face. I mean, Bob Gates and I used to talk about the fact that in the Cold War, those of us who were trained as Soviet experts, felt we could deal with anything because everything was a lesser included case of the US-Soviet rivalry. Today we face both a great power rival in China and in Russia, although I agree with Tony that by most measures Russia is a declining power, but that doesn't mean it is not potentially very dangerous, particularly because of its large nuclear arsenal. But all things considered, if I had to choose between whose problems I'd rather have ours.
I totally agree with Eric on China's vulnerabilities, although I wouldn't want us to see us build a strategy around that view of the world. In part, I read the last kind of 20 years of U.S. policy towards China as hoping that they would make a dumb mistake. That basically we thought maybe they'll mismanage their rise in a way where they accidentally undermine the interests of the Communist Party. And anyway, I think we have a pretty clear-eyed view. The one point I'd make on this is that although we're talking about Russia and China in the same, using the same language, Tony's absolutely right. They have very different kind of longer-term trajectories. Russia has some very difficult long-term economic challenges. They're entirely dependent on energy prices. They have demographic issues. And they, over the long term, probably have some tensions with China. So right now, these countries have formed a kind of, loose alliance. But in the long term, you have a very crowded Northeast China that's energy poor, sitting right next to a sparsely populated, energy-rich Siberia. And I think you're going to see, that's going to create some real tensions. You also have Russian weapon sales to China at the same time that China has said they're going to make a concerted effort to basically be less dependent on other countries for advanced manufacturing. So anyway, so I think of these two blocks as sort of going in different directions over the mid to long term.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Horns of a Dilemma. Be sure to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.